All right. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining. My name is Mike Kajeski. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Medcrypt. I'm joined here by Seth Carmody. Seth?
Hey, Seth Carmody, VP of Regulatory Strategy at Medcrypt.
Yep, and we're excited to talk to you today about a very engaging topic, SBOM management and what you do with an SBOM. Got a couple slides here. I'm going to get fired up. So our company, Medcrypt, we focus exclusively on working with medical device manufacturers on helping them build products that are secure by design. One of the driving forces around that is new FDA requirements, the pre-market guidance that was updated late last year. And this guidance mentions, among other things, having the presence of an SBOM in your regulatory submission. We've seen many medical device manufacturers generate an SBOM for their products. They know what software is in their device and feel that that satisfies the FDA's requirement. What the FDA wants to see is that you have an SBOM. We actually believe it's a little more complex than that. And we wanted to talk about the process by which a device manufacturer would generate an SBOM and then use the information in the SBOM as the input to a vulnerability management process that we're going to describe today. So we'll talk a little bit about the background of the FDA's requirement for SBOMs, what we have seen successful medical device manufacturers do with SBOMs once they are generated, and then go through sort of a live example of analyzing an SBOM, taking a look at the quality of that SBOM, and then seeing what we can infer from the information in that SBOM. I think for those of you who have met Seth or I before, you'll agree we're fairly informal people. We would love to have questions come up in the chat or raise your hand as part of the webinar. We'd love to make this as conversational as possible. Great. All right, so agenda. What does the FDA expect to gain from an SBOM? Why are they asking for this? We want to take a look at a couple of different SBOMs, see what makes an SBOM a good SBOM. Talk about how vulnerabilities can be found in your software once an SBOM is generated, how you prioritize those vulnerabilities, what you do with them once you've identified the high priority vulnerabilities, and then how we've seen device manufacturers document their findings, both for the FDA and their customers. But first, a bit of background. Seth, as many of you know, spent a lot of time at the FDA and was there during the time when the FDA was first creating their cybersecurity requirements. And Seth, I think you had sort of a front row seat to the time where the FDA started to think about SBOMs and ask for them. Do you want to talk maybe a little bit about that experience and what led to the FDA asking for SBOMs?
Yeah, for sure. And by no means was the FDA like the first sort of regulatory or legal entity to think about risks from SBOMs. I mean, SBOMs have been around for licensing purposes, and I know that there was a draft bill, I can't remember if it was Senate or House back in 2014, the Royce bill, I think it's referred to sort of started thinking about the societal benefits from tracking software component level information in tech products. I don't think that bill necessarily went anywhere, but it did sort of form the beginnings of thinking around what would be the benefits at the FDA around SBOMs. And we were dealing with post-market issues at the time. That was going through, but specifically what really drove it home was WannaCry. And we've had so many other, I mean, what Change Healthcare.org is going on right now. Like we've had so many sort of large, not, I guess, sub-cataclysmic events in healthcare in terms of attacks. It's hard to parse them all. But back in 2017, hard to believe, 7 years ago now, WannaCry was on the forefront of the agency's mind and dealing with response questions from hospitals. Basically, I spent time fielding questions from healthcare delivery organizations saying, hey, can you please get me in touch with somebody other than the sales team at the medical device manufacturer who knows what software is contained within the devices that I use to deliver healthcare all day, every day? Am I affected by the Bluetooth, the Eternal Blue series of exploits and the CVEs associated with those exploits? And that really just sort of drove home the notion that even manufacturers, when I turned around and asked them, it took a substantial amount of effort to figure that out. And I'm like, hey, we have a problem here. We're seeing an absolutely in a realized risk happening right now in our healthcare environment. And we are missing the base information to make any decisions as a regulatory agency, as a manufacturer, and as a healthcare ecosystem overall. So that really was that watershed moment that pressed into policy the notion of SBOMs and tracking risk over time related to the software stuff that folks use. So that really captures it, Mike. So hopefully that that gives our listeners some context on where we're coming from here.
You know, I remember in the 6 months to a year after WannaCry, going to healthcare cybersecurity conferences and hearing people talk about this new SBOM requirement as something where device manufacturers needed to generate a list of the software they were using so that they could give it to a hospital and the hospital could do something with it. And there were simultaneously questions about, well, what are hospitals really going to do with this information? And also device manufacturers saying, well, I've given the SBOM to my customers, so my job here is done. I interpreted the FDA's ask for an SBOM more as asking device manufacturers to demonstrate that they know what software is in their products and that they can take action if one of their software components has a critical vulnerability in it. In other words, the eternal blue or swing tooth Bluetooth vulnerabilities that you mentioned in your anecdote there. First of all, a lot of Bluetooth-based devices don't get sold into hospitals; they get sold to users. And as an end user, if I have an SBOM telling me that my insulin pump has this swing tooth vulnerability, what am I going to do with that information? There's not really a whole lot that I can do about it. It really seems to me that the SBOM requirement is less about having device manufacturers communicate what software is in their products, and more about having device manufacturers ensure that there's a process by which they know what vulnerabilities affect their devices, both the ones rolling off the line today and ones that they may have sold 3 years ago that are still out in the field. Does that sound fair to you, Seth?
And I think the important notion that may be not apparent to folks there is that there's a built-in maturity model, right? So I obviously am identifying a real-life use case that would be great to be able to solve in real time. And there's the notion of there's building blocks and foundational elements that are missing. We need to build those foundational elements and building blocks before we can actually move forward with that sort of ideal state and communicating to customers. And I think we are putting those building blocks into place. But to your point, like we have to score one goal before we score 2 goals.
Yeah, exactly. So in software development, there's this concept of test-driven development. And what this means is you're about to write a new feature in your software. And the first thing you're going to do is you're going to write a test that can be run programmatically that at the end of your feature development will tell you, was I successful in implementing the feature that I wanted to implement, yes or no? So in other words, user changes their password. The unit test is when I go into the database and I look at the password, it's different than it was before. And once I write the feature, I can tell if I've been successful or not. I really like the idea of using unit testing in processes that we put together in device manufacturers. And specifically, as we think about implementing software bill of materials and vulnerability management processes, the unit tests that I keep coming back to are these two. If your vulnerability management process is successful, and if it achieves the goals that the FDA wants it to achieve, you should be able to answer these 2 questions. Number one, which products that I have released are impacted by a specific vulnerability, right? CVE number, whatever. Today, the one in the news is this backdoor in a piece of software called XZ. Device manufacturers should be able to, in a very short amount of time, go to some database, some tool, some list, and generate a list of all of the products that they have out in the field today that are using the affected pieces of software. If you can't do that, it means that you're not yet complete with this feature. You're not yet complete with your vulnerability management process. Second, for any given product that's out in the field, not one that you're about to release tomorrow, but maybe one that was released 18 months ago that's still in use at a hospital out in the field, which vulnerabilities affect that product out in the field? And consequently, which of those vulnerabilities are so critical that we should release a software update and release a patch urgently? Maybe the answer is none. Maybe the answer is there are 2 vulnerabilities in that software release that are so critical that we think a patch is due today. These are the sorts of questions that you need to be able to answer using your vulnerability management process. And if you can't, it's our position that there's still some work to do. The FDA in the pre-market guidance, I pulled the screenshot here, manufacturers should identify all known vulnerabilities associated with the device and the software components, including those in CISA's KEV list, the known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. For each vulnerability, manufacturers should describe how the vulnerabilities were discovered to demonstrate, ... This applies for both new devices under development and devices that are out in the field, right? The post-market guidance has lots of information about once the device is out in the field, here's the kind of monitoring that should be in place. You should have a system that alerts you if there are new vulnerabilities that are found in devices that your users have out in the field. So generating an SBOM really is the input to this process. It's not the end result of the process. By the way, this perspective on SBOM and vulnerability management, I don't know if it's universally agreed upon. And if there's anybody, on the call here, we have lots of medical device product security experts. Anybody has a different perspective on this or thinks that we're misreading the FDA's perspective, I'd love to hear it in the chat or in the Q&A. So really an SBOM, the way I look at it is it's not the treasure, it's the treasure map, right? An SBOM is a piece of data that should allow you to execute a process that will find vulnerabilities before a device is released and after a device has been released. There's a minimum amount of data that needs to be in your SBOM in order for it to be useful. And in particular, these three data points are the ones that are most commonly used to correlate software that you're using with vulnerabilities that are known in the NVD or in some other vulnerability database. They are the component name, the name of the software that you're using, the supplier of that software, and the version number. Without those three, it's very difficult to correlate the software in your SBOM to software in the NVD. Now, there are other data fields that are really useful as well, and some other combination of them can provide the same thing. But if your SBOM doesn't have the component name, the supplier, and the version, you're missing really critical information. And also, the quality of that data needs to be such that it's useful, right? Having a component name that just says, Windows and supplier, well, Windows is a bad example, open source library like OpenSSL and a supplier, I don't know, open source and version 1, that's going to get you in the right ballpark of vulnerabilities, but it's not going to tell you if you were impacted by a specific CVE. The FDA pre-market guidance specifically references the NTIA minimum elements. NTIA has a working group around SBOM. They've put together a list of the data points that they think are the minimum viable data elements in an SBOM. They include the supplier name, the component name, the version, but also other unique identifiers like a CPE, which is a long string that describes a piece of software uniquely that is used by the NVD and others. The PURL, the package URL, the place on the internet from which you received the software, or other sorts of unique identifiers can be really helpful in identifying what a piece of software is. Dependency relationship, understanding if you have dependencies of dependencies in your software can be really useful. The author of the SBOM, who put this data together, and when the data was put together. These are the NTIA minimum elements, and we at Medcrypt have seen multiple instances since October 1st of the FDA either rejecting submissions or sending out AIM letters to device manufacturers saying, hey, we looked at your SBOM and you don't have all of this data in your SBOM. You need to fill that data in. Seth, any observations over the last few months of the FDA's review process and how it relates to the data in the SBOM here?
Yeah, for sure. Just a couple of things. One, an AIM letter is an additional information needed letter. I don't know why the agency assigned a double N to it, but for system consistency, at least when I was that's my interpretation when I was there. Yeah, so if folks receive an additional information needed or hold letter, as they used to be called when I started out, we've seen just from a high level, hey, you don't have enough information for us to make decisions as a regulatory agency. The other point is that the FDA has also indicated additional bits of information that will get you in trouble and cause friction if you do not at least answer. One of getting back to your one of your points, Mike, you said if this is all just settled, maybe we should, somebody just tell us and we'll go away, but we don't think it is. End of life and end of support is something that I personally considered and wrote into policy when I was there because I thought it was useful as an agency to know, or to force manufacturers to know when the software that they were using would lose support, because the security posture tends to degrade over time when that date hits, specifically Windows. If you submit a whatever form of information you submit to the agency without a known support level, even if you don't write in unknown, they're gonna be like, hey, this is incomplete, and you're gonna get a rejection, so you're gonna have to go fill it out. And that's coming from our just recent example.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Well, there's a couple really good questions coming in that, as I'm reading them, relate to some slides that we have later here in the conversation. So I'm going to try to make sure I hit all those questions as we get to the right data points here. Another observation, there's a big difference between an SBOM for an application that somebody is writing and an SBOM for a medical device. So 99% of people writing software today are writing software that ultimately gets deployed on the web. And you're writing a Python application that gets deployed in, somewhere in AWS. And the limit of your knowledge as the developer is really the Python application itself. So you use some sort of static code analysis tool to scan your Python application before you release it. It generates an SBOM. That's the SBOM for your Python application. We in the medical device industry have an additional complexity, which is the applications that we write generally get deployed on physical systems that run some sort of operating system. So when you think about a complete SBOM for your medical device, it's going to have not only the fact that you used, for example, OpenSSL in a Python application, it's going to include the operating system that you're deploying on Windows and any third-party applications that are installed on that operating system, like Adobe Acrobat Reader. So we've seen most SBOMs that have made it through FDA review and that satisfy the minimum elements here, covering somewhere between 20 and 200 components. There's a question about dependencies of dependencies. Any of you who have a computer science background and have worked on an operating system know that there is an ungodly amount of software that's built into something like Windows. And generating an SBOM of Windows may in fact be ultimately impossible. There's just so much stuff in there, right? But really what the FDA wants to see is that if there's a vulnerability like the one that caused the WannaCry ransomware attack, that you can identify, are we using the big piece of software that this vulnerability is present in, and can we patch it? And in that case, you just needed to know that you were running Windows 7 versions, X through Y. That's the level of detail that we think the FDA is looking for. So if your software bill of materials looks like this, where you say we use Acrobat Reader version 11 and OpenSSL version 1, I think, and .NET 4 maybe, and remote desktop, like we've seen SBOMs that look like this. This does not make it through FDA scrutiny, right? A couple of things that are wrong with this particular SBOM here, if they're not obvious, is Adobe Acrobat Reader. Well, you want to list who actually made the software, right? Clearly, it's Adobe in that case. Well, for OpenSSL, who made that software? OpenSSL is a hugely popular open source library, and there are multiple different branches and forks of the OpenSSL project. Are you using the main one from OpenSSL.org, or are you using one that came from Red Hat? You really need to include the supplier information. The version information needs to be precise. Adobe Acrobat Reader version 11. Well, what build number? Because some vulnerabilities might affect, version 11.2, but not, 11.3. Remote desktop, which one? .NET, which version of the framework? 4 is, there's a million builds that are all part of version 4. And on top of that, the rest of the NCAA minimum elements are missing here. So we've seen SBOMs that look like this. Having an SBOM that looks like this is better than not having one, but it is going to be very difficult to relate the entries that are in this table here to vulnerabilities that can be found in the NVD. Ultimately, the reason that we have an SBOM is we want to be able to match the components in the SBOM to some vulnerability repository. The NVD is the main vulnerability repository in the US, and I think really in the rest of the world. There are some drama playing out at the NVD right now that if we have time, we can talk about at the end of the presentation here. But ultimately, you want to be able to correlate SBOM entries to some sorts of vulnerabilities. Now, the way that happens in the NVD is generally through something called a CPE, right? The CPE is the unique identifier for the piece of software that a vulnerability affects. Well, what happens if you describe a piece of software that you're using and there is no CPE for it? Generally, what that means is there has not yet been a vulnerability found in that piece of software. So a CPE hasn't been created in the NVD. So it's very valid to have an entry in your SBOM for which there is no reference in the NVD. That's fine. That happens lots of times. What is not okay to have a piece of software in your SBOM like OpenSSL, but not have the appropriate information in your SBOM to correlate it to a CPE that exists in the NVD, because then you're going to miss a bunch of vulnerabilities. Seth, any thoughts there?
Yeah, it's interesting because I have seen a few instances, I think specifically with Google, where they had assigned CPE. There's nothing that prevents a software maker from assigning a CPE prior to a vulnerability, but typically, to your point, a CPE usually gets assigned, in my experience, when a CVE gets assigned. But there's nothing about it special about a CPE that would prevent a software maker from assigning it That's just not how it does. I've seen a couple examples with Google that they released a CPE with no vulnerabilities, and it is fine. Just I kind of default to the human analyst, right? If a human analyst says, I have this piece of software and I go to the NVD and I can't reasonably find anything about it, I can't find a CPE, like, what other conclusion can you come to? It's, as long as you've done your due diligence and document it and tell people about it, I think that's where we need to aim for, at least in this maturity level of what we're trying to do.
Agreed. Once you match your SBOM to CPEs in the NVD, if you have between 20 and 200 entries, it's quite possible you're going to get a ton of vulnerabilities. We've seen, it's not unusual for our customers to analyze an SBOM and find, between 1 and 10,000 vulnerabilities that ostensibly relate to the software that they're running. It's our position that it is not logistically feasible for a software team at a medical device manufacturer to really dig into 10,000 vulnerabilities. So you need some way to filter and to prioritize the vulnerabilities that really require further attention. And we're going to talk about this a little bit in a couple of minutes. I'm not aware of a universally accepted best practice to say that, as long as your vulnerability has a CVSS score less than X, you don't need to worry about it. That's not really the case. But I think your organization needs to articulate a policy that you use to determine whether or not a vulnerability rises to the level of somebody taking a look at it. And it's likely going to require analysis of a few different data points, CVSS being one, but not the only one, exploitability being one, the risk associated with that particular software package, and really, I think also the ease of fix, right? If you've got one patch you could apply to Windows that's going to affect, it's going to fix 8,000 vulnerabilities, you should probably prioritize that particular patch. And then finally, once you've gone through this process, you want to have some way to communicate the information to regulators, to customers that may ask questions, and really to have this information on record. So you want to be able to say, we scan our SBOM weekly, monthly, quarterly, whatever. We find the vulnerabilities. Last time we scanned, we found 1,000 vulnerabilities. Of those 1,000, 15 were high criticality that we took a look at. And here are the individual results for our analysis of each of the 15. And what we have done at Medcrypt is we have a tool that we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes here that generates a report really designed for regulators, specifically the FDA, that says, here's my SBOM. Here's all of the data that I have about the software that I'm using. And then here are all the vulnerabilities we found. And then finally, here are the conclusions we came to about those particular vulnerabilities. So it's important to not only have the SBOM and to scan it at the time of release and the time that you submit to the FDA, but on an ongoing basis, you need to have a process by which new vulnerabilities that come up in the news or are found in the NBD are assessed in your particular product. Seth, any thoughts about the frequency with which that process should be taking place?
I was just answering a question, Mike. So you're saying how often it should be updated or analyzed?
Yeah. If I go through a 510K, I get approval on April 3rd. When's the next time I need to look at this SBOM?
Next day. Like slightly tongue in cheek there, but like this is a dynamic system, right? So any snapshot needs to be looked at a periodicity that makes sense given the rate of which risks are discovered. The FDA is a risk-based agency. So if I submit my 510K on January 1st of 2024, I very likely could have additional vulnerabilities on January 2nd, right? So if you show up to a pre-submission meeting or you show up to a submission issue meeting for a 510K and your last timestamp for your SBOM analysis was January 1st, you may get asked, hey, by the way, how are you keeping track of the vulnerabilities dynamically? So it's a regulator, we love to say that. We're like, oh yeah, all the time. You never can sleep. You must stay up and watch the dashboard. So I do think some notion of continuous management and some sort of alerting to sort of clue you in when things change so that you can respond appropriately is the way to go.
Yep, agreed. I see a good question here. Does FDA expect to receive just a list of components or the list of components and all known vulnerabilities that the tool generates? FDA explicitly says they want to know both what's in your software as well as any vulnerabilities that you know of and the rationale for why you think it's okay to release with those vulnerabilities. Whether or not the vulnerabilities belong on the SBOM itself is sort of a point of debate. I personally feel that the SBOM should be a bill of materials that doesn't change because you've released a piece of software that you've tagged and is going to be the same for a long time. Vulnerabilities are going to change week to week. So we think the vulnerabilities should really live in a separate document. But there's lots of precedent for including vulnerabilities in the SBOM as well, and there are valid reasons to do so. Cool. All right. So I want to go through and actually show an example, and I'm going to share screens a little bit here, so it might be a little bit wonky. Show an example of an SBOM that we generated for example purposes, and then take a look at how we analyze that. We are going to be using a commercial tool that we offer. I'm not trying to make this a sales pitch for our particular tool. It's just the environment in which we do a lot of this analysis. So first, I'm going to take a look at a machine readable SBOM here. So in JSON format, machine readable, fairly human readable as well. This is the Cyclone DX format. There's some data fields that you need to include as part of that SBOM, what version of the format you're using, when you created that SBOM, how you created the SBOM, what tooling was used, the name of the product for which, that this SBOM represents. In our case, I made up a product called LINAC. My background's in radiation oncology, so I have a soft spot for things that make x-rays, and really a list of the components that are in the product. I mentioned previously that most comprehensive SBOMs we've seen include between 20 and 200 components. I made this list artificially short at about 11, but just wanted to go through and look at a couple things. So first, the first component here, bash, very common piece of software. I've got the name, I got the version, I got the type. I don't have a supplier. I don't have a Perl. So it's going to be difficult for me to correlate bash to a CPE in the NVD. So when I'm looking at this SBOM and assessing what's the quality, there's some additional information that's missing here. Here's an example of the piece of software that has impacted the XZ open source library, for which there's a CVE in the news today that we'll talk about a little bit. So I've got a piece of open source software there. I've got a reference to a Linux kernel. That's cool. I've got OpenSSL. That's very common. I've got a Python framework. I've got an operating system. And really, I chose these components not because I think they represent a likely combination of software on a given device, but because they illustrate a couple of points here. But this SBOM checks a couple of boxes. Most of the entries here have a name, a supplier, or a group, and a version. That's great. I've got common open source libraries used in making an application. I've got the application framework. I've got the operating system, and I've got some other things. So it doesn't seem like there's anything really obvious that was missed here. The next thing that we do is we are going to use some tool to correlate the entries in this SBOM to the NVD. And I'm going to show you a tool that we use internally called Helm. And essentially what we do here is we create a product called LINAC version 17.3. I upload my SBOM, and what we've gone through here is said, here's the dependency name, here's the supplier that we have related this to, here's the dependency version. That's really the critical information, in addition to a Perl or a CPE that's provided to match to the NVD. And what we've said here for these four is we've matched these components to something in the NVD through an exact match from some of your data points. That's great. This one, OpenSSL, not found, not an NVD. That seems suspicious. The dependency supplier was listed as OpenSSL project, parentheses, open source. That's almost certainly not how it's described in the NVD. So there's some amount of work required, either manually or through some automated process, where we can go in here and say, let's see what the possible matches are. Okay, OpenSSL from OpenSSL. That's the very likely the version of the software that I'm using. I'm going to apply the match. And then we go through here and say, okay, we actually know what this piece of software is now. That's great. As part of the analysis, when you're first releasing this product and analyzing the SBOM, you really need to go through the majority of these components and figure out, am I not finding a match in the NVD because there isn't one, to our point earlier, or am I not finding a match in the NVD because the data that I've put in doesn't match with what's in the NVD? And it's really common for the data in the SBOM to be close, but not exactly to what's in the NVD. So you definitely got to look for that particular use case there. There's some amount of analysis that's required, either again manually or through some automated process, to match what you have in your SBOM to the NVD. Seth, I know you've spent a lot of time working on matching stuff. Anything you want to point out here?
As a scientist, it immediately strikes me as a data science problem of enormous proportions. The idea of matching up two imperfect data sets sounds like a recipe for difficulty. I think having tools that help line it up for you is super critical. So I think statusing, like, hey, what status is this thing at, and sort of rack and stacking as you work through a workflow of how to like buy down that matching debt, I guess I would call it, is also super helpful, as opposed to like I don't know, just saying, hey, you know, I can't match this. I don't, you know, not knowing if it's in the NBD, but having like these, you can see there in the example, it's not an NBD, right? Like, okay, great, I can move on with my day.
Yeah. And you know, we actually, as a company that builds, among other things, a tool to match components to the NBD, there's almost this perverse disincentive for a device manufacturer to do a good job around matching. If you do a really good job on matching, you are probably going to have a larger number of true positives. You're going to find vulnerabilities that you wouldn't if you did a poor job of matching. But the good news is you're also going to have fewer false positives, right? We've seen situations where we get an SBOM from a customer and we get an analysis of that SBOM that they have done, and we find that, you know, they found 100 vulnerabilities, we found 80. And after we look into it, it turns out that out of the 100 the customer found, 50 of them are just very clearly false positives, right? They relate to software that is just objectively not in the SBOM. And then of the 80 that we found, you know, maybe we find 15 or 16 that the device manufacturer didn't, and 2 of them are of critical, you know, severity. So doing a good job of matching and maximizing for true positives and minimizing false positives really is the objective here. And if you do a good job of that, ultimately you're going to have less work to do long term. Cool. All right, so talked a little bit about matching, and ultimately what we want to do is once we've matched the elements in our SBOM to, you know, in our case, the NVD, we get a list of vulnerabilities here. Whatever tool you're going to use to do this matching is fine. Really what you want to do is make sure that you have a process by which we take a look at this, this list of vulnerabilities and figure out, what do I really need to look at, right? In this case, I have an SBOM with 11 components that resulted in 50 vulnerabilities. We've literally seen reports from vulnerability analysis tools that say that a piece of software has 300,000 vulnerabilities. And the funny part about that is I think there's only like 270,000 vulnerabilities in the NBD. So like you have every vulnerability in the NBD and some that we haven't seen before. That seems unlikely. There are some reasons why that's the case that maybe we can dig into. But ultimately, what we want to do is, regardless of the number of vulnerabilities here, we want to have some way to sort of, you know, rack and stack them. And one metric that we think is really important is exploitability. So there's this EPSS score that says, what is the probability that if you put this piece of software out in the wild, it's going to be exploited? If you have EPSS scores that are in the 90%, you probably want to take a look at them. If you have EPSS scores that are that high, it's very likely that there are exploits for that vulnerability in a toolkit like Metasploit, or that it's listed on the SysAhev list. So if you've got a vulnerability here, you know, 10 out of 10 CVSS, which CVSS you can debate how useful it is, and it's a valid debate, but CVSS of 10 on the SysAhev list, 98% exploitability, like we really should take a look at this. Now, taking a look at it doesn't mean that you're going to determine that you are in fact vulnerable to this vulnerability. It could be that the vulnerability is only exploitable if you have compiled your software with a certain flag or you're using a certain API. But generally, it requires some level of human analysis to figure out, are we vulnerable to this particular vulnerability? There are tools that can be used to do some semi-automated analysis of that vulnerability to figure out if it's exploitable. And in cases where the vulnerability is really well understood and well documented, those automated processes may work just fine. But it's almost, you know, a certainty that at any given time you're going to have a vulnerability or two that requires a human to take a look and say, hey, are we vulnerable to this? Now, if I, as the product security person at this, you know, Linac manufacturer, creates 50 Jira tickets for my engineers to go and look at all these vulnerabilities, they're going to hate me and they're going to start not even looking at these Jira tickets. So if I scroll to the bottom here for exploitability, and I see a vulnerability here with a CVSS of 2.1 and a 0% exploitability, do I need to look into that? Maybe. But if you have a number of vulnerabilities that's larger than you can possibly analyze, and you had to pick a vulnerability or two to look at later, this might be a good candidate. Seth, are there any best practices or rules of thumb that you think the FDA is most willing to accept in terms of you know, why we might not take a look at a particular vulnerability?
interesting phrasing of the question. I thought like like what would purposely exclude a vulnerability. I'm not sure they would be in a position to say maybe if I think like a common way to sort of what is it, vex terminology, right? That it's not even applicable. I mean, like I don't have it on the system, right? I'm running a different version, a version of this which we've ripped out that part of software. Or I've heard people discuss about reachability, which I have some qualms about. But yeah, the notion that somehow the software is not even there or isn't called during the execution of the software program itself, maybe that would fly. But I think regardless, the the agency is always looking for people to document, write it down, don't just make assumptions, tell us what they are, and so that it's basically forms some sort of audit trail.
Yep. Yeah, audit trail being super important, right? Because ultimately, our job as product security people inside device manufacturers is to decrease the risk that our organizations face and decrease the risk that patients face from cybersecurity incidents in the product. And when you do your work and you assess a particular vulnerability, you want to have a record of having done that somewhere, right?
Yeah. Just to look at the flip side, right? And you're going through sort of a what I call like a decision tree analysis here. I don't know if there's a tried and true decision tree that the FDA uses. It certainly was. We were thinking about that concept when I was there. I don't think there's anything formal released. Obviously, they're concerned with patient harm, right? As they dictate in their guidance policies, which makes sense. Even though there are other types of risks, like they're concerned with and charged with from a legal perspective with harms to people, and looking at the risks where cyber risks lead to or could lead to loss of confidentiality, integrity, availability, or sort of authenticity, such that it would harm somebody. Like somehow that has to be in the assessment methodology.
Yep.
But there's no written way to do this 100% correct.
Yep. So maybe just a couple of examples of edge cases here, right? We talked about CVSS score exploitability as being, two inputs into an algorithm. Here we have the XZ vulnerability with a CVSS of 10 that, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert on this particular vulnerability, but if exploited, results in somebody, having a total control over the endpoint. But an EPSS of 0%. Now, I don't know if that means we haven't seen anybody exploit it out in the field yet. But if you have a metric that says, exploitability needs to be greater than 80%, this vulnerability is not going to show up despite having a CVSS of 10. Conversely, here is a vulnerability with a CVSS v2 of 4.3, fairly low, and would likely be considered, a low criticality by most metrics, but top CWE and 95% exploitability in this version of OpenSSL. So really having some sort of filter by which you say, if a vulnerability has a CVSS greater than X, or is an exploitability score greater than Y, or presence on Metasploit, or presence on SysACHEV, that's probably a good way to sort these sorts of things. So, for example, if I go in here and say, hey, just show me anything that's on the SysACHEV list, if you have a vulnerability that's on the SysACHEV list, you should have a really good explanation for why you're not planning to patch the software. It might be true that you need to patch the software, but it doesn't present a risk to the patient. It doesn't present a risk to availability of the system, and therefore you're planning to patch the software in the next release. Maybe that's fine, but it could also be true that it represents a risk to the safe functioning of the device, and you need to release a patch ASAP. So being able to know what vulnerabilities are on SysACHEV is really, really critical. And then the last thing I want to cover before I get into some questions, because there's a great list of questions in the Q&A, is you want to have some way to communicate this information to regulators and to your customers, both at the time of regulatory submission, but also over time. If you submit a 510K to the FDA on January 1st of 2024, but then 9 months later in September, your customer asks for an SBOM and a vulnerability report, the SBOM probably hasn't changed since January 1st. In fact, it shouldn't have changed, but the list of vulnerabilities almost certainly has, right? So you need some way to communicate this information to customers if you choose to share that vulnerability information with them. And the way that we do that, I'm going to switch what I'm sharing here. We have a function in our SBOM tool Helm that generates what we call an FDA report, which has a cover page where you can describe what the software is that you're communicating. It has the SBOM in a human readable format. You can also do a machine readable export as well that talks about what product this software is in, who the supplier is, what the version is. This list will include all of the augmented data that came from our software, things that we inferred about the software. We highlight the different categories of information, whether it's the information the FDA has explicitly asked for in their guidance, the NCIA minimum elements to make it visually very easy to see, hey, we don't have any information about dependency relationship. Maybe we should fill some of that in here so that you can convey this information to a regulator or a customer, and then a list of all the CVEs as well. So, here are the CVEs, here's a description of the CVE, the CVSS score, and some additional information to help the reader understand what are the vulnerabilities and what is it that you plan to do about them. If the members of the audience here have one takeaway from this webinar, I hope that it is that the SBOM is not a homework assignment that is due at your date of submission, after which you are done your homework. It really is an input to a process that needs to be continued throughout the life of the device so that you can know if there is a vulnerability that affects one of your devices before an attacker does, or before a hospital ends up in a bad situation due to somebody exploiting it. All right, let me take a look at some of the questions we got here. Let's see. We have software that is very difficult to decompose into 100% into software units. You have to decide and record the rationale levels of decomposition. Agreed. We had a conversation with Microsoft. We have a close relationship and partnership with Microsoft. And one of their SBOM experts said, it would almost be impossible to generate an SBOM for Windows because you have just, it's turtles all the way down, levels and levels of dependencies. And from a practical perspective, if we think back to the origin of why is the FDA asking for an SBOM, as we understand it, it was WannaCry. Are you running a version of Windows that has this SMB vulnerability that's allowing the ransomware to attack? Well, I don't need to know 17 levels down in Windows what software is in there. I need to know that I'm running Windows 7 build number X. That's the level of detail that's required, right? Another good example is OpenSSL has lots of software inside of it. Do I need to know what that software is? Probably not in that case, because when a vulnerability is found in OpenSSL, it's reported as a vulnerability in OpenSSL. Knowing what version I'm using is fairly sufficient. So it's very difficult to draw a clean line to say, you need an SBOM for dependencies 2 levels deep. It's more like, what are the types of software components that generally have vulnerabilities? Can we enumerate all of them? And do we have sufficient data to understand if we're impacted by a vulnerability there? How's the FDA treating all the software where no CPEs exist in the NVD? There's lots of software for which there is no CPE in the NVD. If you've provided the NCIA minimum elements, if you've provided the software name, the supplier name, the version, and there's no CPE, there's no CPE. There's nothing else that you can do there. If you have a Perl, if it's an open source piece of software that you got off of GitHub and you can include the Perl, even better. But it's totally valid to have entries for which there is no CPE that's in the NVD currently. Let's see, dependency relationship, we talked about that a little bit. How do you assess the support level for open source software? I don't think that our industry is at a state of equilibrium around SBOM, meaning these are changing and evolving requirements. The notion of having a data field for end of life, end of support is really valid for an operating system. If you're running, Windows XP that hasn't been supported in 7 years, like you should know that, a regulator should know it, your customer should know it. It's very clear that the end of life date is useful there. What is the end of life date for the current version of OpenSSL? There isn't one, right? For version 3. Whatever is the current build, there isn't one. So that's a data field where it is very, in my opinion, valid to say, NA. There's no end of support here. But if you're running commercial software for which there is a known end of life, end of support date in there, it is to everybody's advantage for you to record that. Seth, any other thoughts there?
None, and I'm trying to go through all the questions and answer via text. So I'm down to a question by Michael Katz now about a bit of talking about open source and third-party software. Can you highlight the expectation of the FDA to include device manufacturer developed components with their SBOM? And some examples would be appreciated.
Yeah. So I come from the radiation oncology space. We write a piece of software called Linac controller.exe. And I write that software. It's something that I wrote. There could be a vulnerability in linaccontroller.exe. Maybe there'll be a CVE for it one day. However, it's more likely that in the NVD, there will be a vulnerability in an open source or commercial piece of software that I used inside linaccontroller.exe. So if we think about the three categories of SBOM components, the operating system for the device that's running, any commercial software like Adobe, Reader, Acrobat Reader that's on the system, and then the open source libraries in your applications, that probably satisfies 99% of the use cases. If for some reason it is advantageous for you to record that your device is running, Medcrypt linaccontroller.exe version 2.7, great, throw it in there. But it's likely to be less useful of an entry than the other entries that we mentioned previously. One other one that I want to address here that I think you talked about, Seth. Somebody talked about having a medical device with multiple components. Should one create a single SBOM consisting of everything, or individual SBOMs for each components? It's a good question, and there are circumstances where one could imagine one big monolithic SBOM and smaller individual SBOMs. When I think of a medical device, capital M, capital D, I think of a system that has a 510K clearance that I sell together to a customer. And if those components are always packaged together, having one SBOM for that collection of endpoints is totally valid. Usually what we see, in the case of an implantable and a programmer, or an implantable and a bedside monitor, the implant software likely has a different development cycle than the bedside monitor's software or the programmer software. And therefore, having an SBOM that's separate for each of those is likely advantageous, because you can have a 10-year-old programmer that has an SBOM that represents the software that's on it from 10 years ago, and an implant with a different SBOM because it's brand new and the software was just released 3 months ago. I think both are valid. Let's see. If you have a mitigation for a CVE, or the CVE poses minimal risk, does the FDA still expect you to fix the issue? You can't fix every CVE, right? There are valid cases where you have 10,000 CVEs. The FDA wants to see that you have a process by which you're evaluating these and you're addressing any CVEs that actually pose harm to patients or pose harm to your device. And if there's compensating controls in place, there's regulatory precedent for that. Does Helm come the validation process from package from Medcrypt in which medical device manufacturers can leverage as part of its use? I'm ironically not a RA/QA expert. In fact, I was a younger, eager software developer at a medical device manufacturer in the past for whom the RA/QA system was a thorn in my side. I'm now paying the karmic price of that, working in this field now. My understanding is that the third-party supplier of software can verify the software. We can give you all of our testing documentation to show that the software does what it's supposed to do. The validation needs to happen on the side of the device manufacturer. You need to show that you've chosen the right software that performs the right purpose. We have lots of documentation and services available to help you do that validation. But as I understand it, we can help, but the device manufacturer ultimately needs to do any validation. Most of the examples here is related to software running on operating systems. Can you help me imagine what an SBOM and vulnerabilities looks like for bare metal firmware? Yeah, it's very simple. You take out Adobe Acrobat Reader and Windows, and you have that software, right? There are a couple of edge cases here. If you have C code running on bare metal, you probably aren't running OpenSSL, but you might be running, embed TLS, which is an analogous cryptography library that's used on embedded systems. You probably have a smaller number of entries in your SBOM because there's less software and there's less memory. But you may also have additional information that you want to include, like the firmware version of the microcontroller that you are using that wouldn't be present in other SBOMs. So I mentioned most of the valid SBOMs we've seen have between 20 and 200 components. For an embedded system running C code on bare metal, you're probably on the lower end of that spectrum. Are you considering to include requirements for CE mark? Yep, Seth said absolutely. Is Helm a medical device specific tool, or will it work just as well with commercial non-medical device products? I love that question. So we, Medcrypt, are solely focused on the med tech medical device space. Therefore, when we think about new features, we think about features that medical device manufacturers, like some of those who are investors in our company, and problems they would have and features they would want. But we know that there are similar analogous problems in other verticals where this tool could be useful. And we've had those sorts of conversations with customers in other verticals as well as other partners. So essentially, we're going to continue building features that we think are useful for the med tech space, but would not be surprised if in the not too distant future, people in other verticals are using the tool as well. Cool. All right. I think we addressed most of the questions there. Happy to answer any other questions that people might have. I got one more slide here I would like to share to kind of sum things up. Hopefully we were not too verbose and not too boring and didn't get into too much detail here. But in summary, I think a good test for your existing SBOM and vulnerability management process is your ability to answer the question, which of my products are impacted by CVE 2023-44487? Just picking one at random. Well, not entirely at random. It's one that's on the CISA KEV list and we've seen in a bunch of SBOMs. But if you know what software system you can go to in your company to type in that CVE string and get a list of products, then you're in really good shape. If you don't, or if it would require a lot of manual processes, or God forbid, you got to go to an SAP somewhere to figure something out, you probably want to figure out a way to answer that question quickly. For a given product, can you generate a list of all CVEs for that product? If you are selling a medical device to a large health system that has a very well-informed cybersecurity team, and they say, hey, give me your SBOM, they're going to do their own analysis on your SBOM. And they might say, hey, you've got 1,000 CVEs in here. We're not going to buy this thing. You want to be able to respond with, yes, we do. But here's the analysis we've done on each of those 1,000. And here are the 2 that we've determined are, in fact, a concern. And we have a patch coming for that in 3 months. You want to be able to answer that well to your customers. You want to ensure that your SBOMs have the minimum required data. Don't allow it to look like that spreadsheet that I showed a couple slides earlier, where it's some random string that says Windows, I think. Ensure that you're able to match reliably to the NVD or some other reputable vulnerability database. Again, there's some changes afoot at NVD, but really when you're submitting to a regulator like the FDA, you want to give them as few questions as possible. And if you're saying, hey, we're matching to some obscure vulnerability source that has nothing to do with NVD, you're probably going to have some explaining to do. If you can say we're matching to that source and NVD, that's even better. You want to have some method to prioritize what vulnerabilities you take a look at. Exploitability is a really important factor. CVSS score is also an important factor, but I would argue maybe less so. You want to have a process to determine which of these vulnerabilities require an urgent patch, if any. And you want to have a record of what you found, so that if, God forbid, there's some incident and, somebody's doing a post-mortem 3 months in the future, and they say, hey, you had this vulnerability that was on the CISA KEV list. It was present in your device for a year, but you didn't patch it. Why is that? You want to be able to go back and say, well, we did an analysis, and based on what we knew on April 3rd, 2024, we had determined it wasn't exploitable. It turns out we were wrong. That happens, but we have a record of the analysis that we did. That's really important. So that's it for what we had covered today. We'd love to continue this conversation offline. You can shoot us an email at info@medcrypt.com or mike@medcrypt.com, seth@medcrypt.com. We get very, Seth and I are very interested in this problem from both a practical and an academic perspective. So we'd love to jump on a call and talk about any other details that you have, any other questions that you have. Seth, any closing thoughts?
I'm not sure we dug into the SBOM quality perspective. So a couple of things that, as you or your organizations work through this problem set, one, quality matters, and we have worked with clients that are using commercial tools that we have dug into, right, and found issues. It's not to say that we can't use those tools, but they need some oversight from a quality perspective to double check and make sure that we're not missing stuff. In some cases, and Mike, you probably brought this up, but I probably missed it in typing answers to folks, was like missing CISA KEVs, right, is probably not the right, not the right unit test to be missing. And unfortunately, tooling is tooling, but we need to, inject a bit of human oversight, and that can be laborious given the size of the task for some of you that already exists.
Awesome. Agreed. All right. Well, thank you everybody for attending. Really appreciate your time. Hopefully this was helpful, and please feel free to send any feedback via email. We'd love to hear about it. Thank you, everyone.
The webinar has ended. Thank you for joining. Goodbye.